Hello, folks. Welcome. Berlin, Switzerland, Brazil, I see. Many places in between. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time, if you haven't been able to join us yet, to the Institute for Social Ecology's 2021 Summer Intensive, From Social Distancing to Social Transformation. I'm Blair Taylor. I'm the program of the ISE, and it's been a really fantastic day and a half already of the intensive, just really high-level discussions and conversations about how we can best create a free and ecological society. And of course, that means also a feminist society. And so I'm very thrilled that we have Catherine Rottenberg joining us today from the UK, who very nicely stepped in to fill the slot that had previously been for Dilar Dirick, who unfortunately had a back injury and couldn't join us. So we really wish her a speedy recovery as soon as possible. Catherine was going to speak tomorrow. She teaches in the Department of American and Canadian Studies at the University of Nottingham. And she has a wide range of publications, but two books include the recently published co-authored Care Manifesto, which really puts care at the heart of debates about our current crisis, whether that's intimate familial care, childcare, healthcare, elder care, to care for the natural world, which is obviously an important concern for the ISE, and putting forth a vision for what a truly caring world would look like. And another book that came out in 2018 as part of Oxford University Press's Heretical Thought series, I love that title, was The Rise of Neoliberal Feminism, which looks at how a kind of narrow, individualistic, and pro-capitalist form of feminism became hegemonic and plays also an important legitimating role for the status quo. So Catherine's talk today is going to kind of fuse these two components together about the bad kind of feminism that unfortunately in many people's minds outside of our movements, in many cases associate with feminism, and a different kind of feminism that is intersectional, that is focused on care, and that's for people and for the natural world. And I'll just also mention, Catherine is not only a scholar, but she's also an activist. She's been involved in numerous social justice movements like the anti-occupation organization Tayyush, Arab Jewish Partnership, and she's currently a committee member of the University of Nottingham University and College Union. So really thrilled to have you join us today. So I will give you the floor and look forward to the discussion to come. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Blair, and it's really wonderful to be here. It's really late at night, so you'll have to excuse me if I get tired. But I've never been at an intensive, so this is my first time too, and I'm really very, very eager to hear sort of responses and comments about the two projects. And so what I thought I would do, since I didn't have tomorrow to prepare, is I'm going to sort of put together the two projects. And the first one I'm going to talk about is neoliberal feminism, and sort of what I was trying to, what I was doing and trying to think about. And the second, I'm going to talk about the Care Manifesto, which is sort of a way out of the rut of neoliberal feminism as far as I was thinking about it. So I'm going to first share with you my research on neoliberal feminism, and I'm going to put on, I'm going to share my screen if I can. And so make it a little more. Yep. Okay. Everybody can see it? Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm going to give about a 20-25 minute lecture on the rise of neoliberal feminism, and then I'm going to open it up for comments and discussions and take a little bit a break, and then come back to the Care Manifesto. But what I'd like to do is really to give a sense of the genesis of this project, why I began writing on the rise of neoliberal feminism, and sort of the particular issues that I was concerned about and preoccupied with. And then I'm going to say a few words about how I understand neoliberal feminism. Wait, let me put this on. Before I give a brief synopsis of some of my main arguments, and how I understand the relationship between neoliberal feminism and popular feminism, which we can talk about also in the Q&A. So I want to say a few words about how this project came into being. The first time I really began to think about the entanglement of neoliberalism and feminism was in 2012, and that was during the Obama era. But when I completed my book, it was already 2017. Books take a while to write, and we had already entered the Trump era. And during those 5 years, as many of you in the US know very well, the social, cultural, and political landscape in the US had in many ways changed quite dramatically. One could say that in 2012, we had gotten used to what Nancy Fraser has termed progressive neoliberalism. And then with the rise of Trump, we began to see a new configuration, neoliberalism converging with hypernationalism and the shameless white supremacy. And Cornel West has called these forces neo-fascism, and Wendy Brown has called them libertarian, authoritarian, and statist. And really, what was hard about writing a book like this was that I was looking at and examining and taking note of contemporary issues. And of course, events refused to wait until I processed and theorized them. So over the course of writing this book, my ideas around neoliberal feminism changed. And so what I'm going to give you now is sort of a kind of trajectory, how it came about. So the project began, as I mentioned, in 2012 when I was on sabbatical in the US. And this was a year in which Anne-Marie Slaughter's Why Women Still Can't Have It All was published in The Atlantic. I don't know if any of you remember it, but that piece created a real stir, generated a lot of debate, and it catapulted Slaughter, who was a former dean at Princeton, was a top advisor to Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, into the national spotlight. And what does Slaughter do in that piece? Well, she comes out as a feminist and tries to give an account of why professional women are still finding it so difficult to balance career demands with their desire for an active home life. She claims that this difficulty is due to social norms and the inflexibility of US workplace culture, which she claims continue to privilege career advancement over family. And what's so interesting is that Slaughter's piece went on to become one of the most, if not the most, read and downloaded pieces in the history of The Atlantic. But of course, that was also the year in which the COO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg, came out with her Feminist Manifesto, Lean In. So this was, and it instantly became a New York Times bestseller. And in Lean In, Sandberg also comes out as a feminist and urges women to reaffirm their commitment to work, insisting that this commitment to work will provide women with more choice about how to cultivate a felicitous, a happy work-family balance. So all of a sudden, what seemed powerful and high-power women were publicly identifying as feminists, something that we hadn't seen in the past. I didn't remember in my lifetime. And it was at that point that I began to read these two manifestos really carefully. Now, I'm trained as a literary critic, so reading Slaughter and later Sandberg was really an exercise in close textual analysis. And at the time, I was struck by a number of rhetorical aspects, but most specifically by the circulation of what I came to see as a new feminist vocabulary, where terms like happiness, balance, lean in were replacing key terms traditionally inseparable from public feminist discussions and debates, namely autonomy, rights, liberation, social justice. And I found it really interesting that and disturbing, in the wake of these publications, more and more high power and celebrity women were coming out as feminists. So this was also not long after cultural critics Rosalind Gill and Angela McRobbie had documented the entrenchment of what they called post-feminist sensibility in mainstream and popular Anglo-American culture, which they argued had been doing such a good job in disavowing or repudiating the need for feminism. So this was the sensibility where, in fact, empowerment, that feminism had already taken. There was no longer any need for feminism because women were now empowered and had equal rights. So they talked about this in terms of post-feminism. But post-feminist repudiates feminism. There's no avowal of feminism. There's no avowal of gender inequality. So this was something else was happening here. And so I became preoccupied with a number of questions, including how can we explain this feminist resurgence in the wake of post-feminism? And how does this emergent feminist discourse differ from previous public feminist discussions? And at the time, I began to realize that in order to really understand the kind of cultural work that this new variant of feminism was carrying out, I would have to take into consideration a number of factors. And the first factor was just simply the surge in feminist discourse in popular and mainstream venues in the US. And since I've been in the UK for the last few years, you see it in the UK too. So if you think about 2010, things are very different. Today, the F word is literally everywhere. It's in mainstream print media, it's in popular television shows like The Good Wife and New York Times bestselling books like Lean In. And of course, we also have the once UK princess in the US, I think. So these are the kinds of cultural texts that I look at in my book. And so that's the first factor. The second factor is that this mainstreaming and popularization has often gone hand in hand with defanging feminism and particularly mainstream liberal feminism of its oppositional potential. And many scholars have already demonstrated that more than simply being popularized, feminist themes have increasingly dovetailed and indeed converged with dominant ultranationalist ideologies and conservative forces, and that's true across the globe. So we could think here of Marine Le Pen's The National Front, where she invokes women's rights to advance its anti-Muslim and anti-immigration nationalist project. And so that's the second factor. And then the third factor, which occurred more recently, and this was happening as I was finishing my book actually, is the resurgence of mass feminist mobilization. And that, in many ways, these mass mobilizations differ quite radically from neoliberal feminism. And I'll return to the resurgence. And this was part of what I was trying to come to terms with in 2017 in the wake, of course, of Trump's election, but trying to understand how these pieces all fit together. Now, I just want to make sure that I'm not misunderstood. I'm not saying that feminist resistance on the ground disappeared at any moment in time, or that all feminist discourse had been defanged. That's clearly not the case. But in my work, what I've been interested in and also often disturbed by is the way in which feminism has been enfolded into mainstream common sense and the popular media in the US over the past now almost decade, and how identifying a feminist has become a source of social and cultural capital and a mark of pride for an increasing number of highly visible and powerful women of all political stripes. And so that was kind of problematic that I became preoccupied with, and that I wanted to try and understand because it was very bizarre to me. So in my research, what I posit is that we have witnessed the emergence of a new variant of feminism in the US, which I also claim revolves centrally around this notion of a happy work-family balance. So balance has been incorporated into the social imagination as a cultural good, as well as has helped to create a new ideal of emancipated womanhood, this professional woman who's able to balance a successful career with a satisfying family life. So for anyone who's in doubt about how dominant this idea of happy work-family balance has become for professional women, all you have to do is look at the New York Times. You'll see this idea of balance repeatedly emerges in the pages, or you can read Michelle Obama's memoir, Becoming. Well, it's not so new anymore, but there you have the happy work-family balance as this ideal. So but what's interesting here is that it had increasingly become represented as a progressive feminist ideal. And this new feminist ideal, I suggest, needs to be understood as shaping women's desires, their aspirations, their behavior. And as I try to show in my book, it actually helps to create a feminist subject informed through and through by market metrics. So that's, in short, what I term neoliberal feminism. So here's just another example. This is a feminism that's been unmoored from key terms like equality, justice, emancipation, autonomy. It's also a feminism that disavows the socio-economic and cultural structures shaping our lives. And it spawns a subject who accepts full responsibility for her own well-being and self-care, which are predicated on creating or crafting a felicitous work-family balance. And work-family balance is in its turn itself based on this cost-benefit calculus. So this is precisely as Blair described at the beginning, a hyper-individualizing feminism, which encourages, exhorts individual women to organize their lives in order to achieve a happy work-family balance. It incites women to perceive themselves as human capital and encourages them to invest in themselves and to be empowered and to be confident. And ultimately, it produces a new feminist subject who is incessantly pressed to take on full responsibility for her own well-being and self-care. So how am I using neoliberalism? So the way that I draw on political theorists Michelle Fair and Wendy Brown, and the way that I understand neoliberalism is it's not merely an economic system or a set of policies that facilitate intensified privatization and deregulation, but I understand it, again, drawing mostly on Brown, as a dominant political rationality or a normative form of reason that moves to and from the management of the state to the inner workings of the subject, recasting individuals as entrepreneurial, but also as capital enhancing agents. So neoliberalism is a form of reason that remakes everything into the image of the market. And this kind of reason encourages us to perceive ourselves through the lens of this calculative metrics. It encourages us to organize every social, political, and even affective aspect of our lives as though we were an Excel spreadsheet. Neoliberal rationality extends a specific formulation of economic values, practices, and metrics to every dimension of human life. And as a result, it helps transform human subjects into this kind of speck of capital, into entrepreneurial agents. So we come to think of ourselves as specks of capital and as constantly needing to be innovative and entrepreneurial and to invest in ourselves in order to ensure that we remain competitive and valuable. And so this is why there's a focus on entrepreneurship and corporate success, because neoliberalism is precisely about the reduction of everything, even our own selves, into this financialized corporate model. So I say all this and give this definition because in my research, I argue, maybe provocatively, that neoliberalism may actually need feminism. And why does it need feminism? Because it needs to resolve, at least temporarily, one of its internal relations in relation to gender. So as an economic order, neoliberalism relies on reproduction and care work in order to reproduce and maintain human capital. But on the other hand, as a political rationality, and here I'm contrasting it to liberalism, neoliberalism has no lexicon that can recognize, let alone value, reproduction and care work. So the ideal neoliberal subject is not gendered, it's not raced, it's not classed. The subject, like everything else, including our political imagination and the way that we understand ourselves, is reduced to a market metrics and is recast as a speck of capital. But what is different from liberalism, neoliberalism, as opposed to liberalism, as many scholars have already underscored, is that under neoliberalism, different registers, political, economic, social, and affective, collapse, and all forms of valuing, of valuation, of evaluating transpire through this cost-benefit metrics. And that's not to say that liberalism, I'm not trying to reclaim liberalism. We know from feminist political theorists that liberalism is profoundly problematic, but what I'm trying to show here, drawing on other scholars, is that neoliberalism empties out all other imaginaries so that homo politicus is completely superseded by homo economicus. So when you think about the ways in which economic growth, profitability, competition, winners and losers have come to dominate our public discussion from left to right, then we begin to see the way in which neoliberalism sort of empties out all other imaginaries. So my overarching argument in the book is that neoliberal feminism has been operating as a kind of pushback to the total conversion of upwardly mobile or so-called aspirational women into generic human capital. So what's paradoxical here or counterintuitive is that neoliberal feminism maintains reproduction as part of middle class or so-called aspirational women's normative trajectory and posits balance as its ultimate ideal. So neoliberal feminism actually helps to maintain a vocabulary, a discourse, a lexicon of reproduction and care work, while actually ensuring that all of responsibility for these forms of labor, but not necessarily all of the labor itself, falls squarely on the shoulder of these women. You can outsource this. it's in this way that it solves its own constituent tension, the quandary of reproduction and care work, at least temporarily. So the argument is that neoliberal feminism produces and maintains a distinctive and affective, so it's affective, it works with this happiness register. So it maintains a distinctive and affective vocabulary of reproduction and care work within neoliberalism. And again, it's this notion of a happy work-family balance. Now, I also hypothesize in the book that as reproductive technology develops, a certain strata of women will likely be able to outsource reproduction and care work more and more, and that will ensure the re-entrenchment of the so-called aspirational subject as generic capital, while producing a whole other class of women who are conceived as not fully responsibilized and thus exploitable and disposable. So if you think about the reality in which most often it's women of color, it's poor and immigrant women who serve as the unacknowledged care workers who actually enable professional women to strive towards balance in their lives, neoliberal feminism helps to reproduce and legitimize and actually render even more invisible the labor that these other women, these other female subjects do. And it legitimizes the exploitation of these other subjects, but it also helps to disarticulate. It makes it much more difficult to find a vocabulary with which to address these vast inequalities. So my book is very pessimistic, but I'm not going to end on a pessimistic note. And what was so interesting for me is as I was finishing, and it was precisely when you had the eruption of mass mobilization in the United States, but it didn't begin in the United States. But the Women's March was the first mass mobilization that sort of got me thinking about what was changing in the wake of Trump. So I'm going to return to my remarks at the beginning, and when I talked about that third factor, when we think about the rise of neoliberal feminism, and then suddenly the ways in which feminism has become popular in ways that I could never have imagined when I was growing up in the US. So in order to the third factor that needs to be taken into consideration when thinking about the emergence of this new variant of feminism and the kind of cultural work it has been carrying out, I want to suggest, no, that didn't make sense. I want to suggest that the entrenchment of neoliberal feminism and the process of feminism's popularization have not only translated into the mobilization of feminist themes for neoconservative or neoliberal capitalist agendas. Precisely because neoliberal feminism has gained prominence in the last decade, and precisely because it constantly encourages individual women to focus on their own well-being and aspirations in the form of this happy work-family balance, and therefore buttresses the logic of neoliberalism, this variant of feminism has been rendered palatable and even desirable, which in turn has facilitated its widespread embrace and circulation. And I think that that's key, because then neoliberal feminism needs to be understood as having helped to create the cultural conditions enabling the emergence of what Sarah Banet-Weiser calls popular feminism. That, where you go in, I go to my son's high school and I can buy, a feminist sweatshirt. So that's the kind of where feminism has suddenly become popular. Precipitating feminism's ever wider visibility and dissemination across media venues in the Anglo-American world. So what am I saying? I'm saying that this process of popularization has actually generated a double-edged sword, since power always produces its own vulnerability. As neoliberal feminism has facilitated feminism's renewed visibility and widespread embrace, most prominently in the form of a mediated popular feminism, it has also, and paradoxically, helped to pave the way for more militant and mass feminist movements, such as the Women's March and the Global Women's Strike. Now, we know that a lot of the infrastructure for the relatively recent feminist groundswell was already in place. We know that the Me Too campaign, the hashtag Me Too campaign, initially emerged over a decade ago as part of a grassroots movement spearheaded by the African-American activist Savannah Burke, and that it also comes on the heels of other mobilizations that maybe are less familiar, such as Slut Walk. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that in addition to Trump's election, right, and the reappearance of a shameless sexism in the public sphere, which had its own galvanizing effect, movements like Me Too were able to gain such traction at this particular moment in history, at least in part because feminism had already been embraced and rendered desirable by high power corporate women like Sheryl Sandberg, Hollywood stars like Emma Watson, as well as music celebrities like Beyonce, and that's just a few. So what I'm suggesting is that these various feminist manifestations all suggest that we are experiencing a feminist renaissance of sorts. And I think that we're at a crossroads in all kinds of ways. And the urgent question then is, how can we sustain and broaden this feminist renaissance as counter-hegemonic, as intersectional social justice agenda, and thus as a threat to the powers that be, while rejecting neoliberal feminist logic. So that's neoliberal feminism in a nutshell. That's my thinking up to now. And then you'll see that as a reaction to, as a way of sort of trying to answer that question, my work goes into care. But I really would like now to hear from you all and hear whether you buy it, whether you think that it's the analysis needs to be updated in particular ways. Any thoughts, comments, anything?
Thanks so much. The floor is open. And for those who haven't participated prior to this point, we ask that you put an asterisk in the chat box, just so it's a little bit easier to keep track of, and I'll keep stack.
Is it
Any
the
questions?
chat, Claire?
What's that?
Is it, I'll stop my sharing my screen so I can see.
Yeah, there's a
Okay, there we go.
box inside. And just one more reminder too, if folks could, just briefly say your name and where you're from if you ask a question or make a comment. It's nice to know who you are, where you're coming from. Damien, you want to start us off?
No, Felix first.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Thank you. Felix, please.
Hi, my name is Felix. My Wi-Fi connection is really bad, so I'm not going to try to go on camera. I am on the west coast of the United States. I use these or zers pronouns. Great talk. Thank you for giving it.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks, Felix. Damien, then, please.
Okay, I thought Felix cut off, but okay.
Oh, maybe they did.
Oh yeah, I thought it was just a compliment. I
wasn't sure, actually. Was there more, Felix? If there was, please
go ahead. You just muted yourself, I think, or
okay.
Wi-Fi came on.
Okay,
well,
let's just go there.
Please go ahead.
Hey, I'm Damian. I'm from Chile. Very glad to be here. Very interesting. I had a very important, I think it's very important, at least for Chile. The big issue, because we have a very, very strong feminist movement here, at least I would think. I'm guessing that comparing to the rest of Latin America, maybe the world, feminism in Chile has a very strong ground. Like it's filled everywhere. And the main, it's not really an issue, but it's a thing that I've always thought about and debated. I wanted to know the role of separatism in feminism. The idea that it's like the ideology and the work that's got to be put into it has to be made by women and trans folk and anything basically except for men, and that men can be part of feminism as pretty much allies or just in the sidelines instead of really participating for real. And I wanted to know if you have any thoughts on that or any knowledge on that, because I don't know what's the situation for feminism anywhere else. So yeah.
Let me ask you a question. Is separatism something in Chile that has become increasingly prominent, or is it something that is, it has?
No, it's the norm, really.
It's the norm. And what's the relationship between the Chilean feminist movement and, for example, Ni Uno Menos, so not one less in South America? So the Argentinian.
In what? Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
It's the Argentinian South American feminist mobilization, not one less. which doesn't have the kind of separatist, as far as I understand it.
Oh, well, as far as I do, it does. But I could be mistaken. I haven't really studied it as much as I can. I'm only I've talked and debated with a ton of friends of mine, women friends, and other people, about the whole idea. But it's not really debated at all. Like, separatism is accepted as the main form of feminism and the only way. It's not at all neoliberal in any way, because just because it's Latin America, we've got this whole tradition of being really anti-colonial. So it's got a ton of socialist elements in it, and it's really ground up and really sometimes anarchist. But since it started, which I would say it was like in 2015 or something, maybe, like for real, not because it existed way before that, of course, but it became really prominent around 2015, 2013, maybe. It's always been separatist, really, really separatist. So yeah.
It's an interesting, I don't know if anybody else wants to come in. I think that in the US, and also what I understand of the UK in terms of the history, that there are elements within feminist mobilization which would align with the kind of separatism that you're talking about, but that's become less and less true in feminist mobilizations in the Anglo-American world. Although what you're seeing in terms of it, I mean, there's a certain the question of how men, sort of cis men, fit into the equation is a question, I think, that does come up, even if it's not talked about and debated in the same ways that it was in the 1970s, for example. Although the whole notion of intersectionality and the whole idea of coalitional and ways of not being exclusive have, I think, been the sort of prominent way of mobilizing for at least in the global women's strike. As allies, men were welcome, and the Women's March, men were certainly welcome. And I think we need to also separate between sort of feminist theory and mobilization, and that it's an artificial distinction. And yet I think that the mobilization, what you're talking about, is more on the ground, what's happening now, in terms of maybe I'm wrong. So that would be my. I don't see the separatism. What I do see now in the UK, which is disturbing, but also sort of a repetition of certain kinds of exclusions, is the trans radical feminist debate. And there, the question of women-only spaces and sort of that the ways in which exclusions of certain people becomes an issue. So it's not men per se. It's this, that it's only, women who have been born, women who, which I find this very disturbing in the way that it plays itself out and becomes sort of the prominent. It takes the news, right? So that it becomes sort of it takes over, and it's actually a very small percentage of radical feminists who are transphobic in that way. But I'm going to stop. Let's hear from other.
Okay, so why don't we take a couple questions at a time and just we can see if we can find some commonality or pull them together, highlight tension. So we've got an Ashley, Nick, and Felix.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I just wanted to say I'm a nurse, and some of what you said really resonated with me regarding some of the behaviors that I see in nurses, as far as, delegation, rationing of care, creating stratification in the nursing labor workforce, as far as like CNAs, home health aides, PCAs, who are also doing more domestic hands-on work versus the managerial, administrative power, directional role of the nurse. And also the idea that self-care is really transformed into self-regulation. So just maybe if you have seen any other parallels with like the feminism is transferring into like a work ethic of some sort.
that's a really interesting comment. And I think that there's a lot of stuff coming on the care crisis and talking specifically about care workers and so the ways in which the neoliberalism has been incorporated into the workplace in that way. But one of the things that I do think is true in terms of the way that neoliberal rationality and neoliberal feminism operates is precisely that kind of self-monitoring, and that when we have to invest in the self all the time, right, in order to maintain our value in the marketplace, that means that we're constantly monitoring ourselves and we're constantly so yes, I think that's, you see that increasingly also in universities, you see that in terms of care work, right? So that what gets how it becomes about calculating your time. And yes, so I think that's a really interesting point, the way in which the labor that goes into self-monitoring, and that's part of the work-family balance, absolutely.
So how about Nick?
Hi, I'm also here with Ava in Australia. I'm a disability support worker and frequently recognize how the industry is becoming more commercialized and commodified because our work is becoming more gig-based and being brought into like online marketplaces where we're like asked to sell our kind of profiles in a very like gender-based way. And I was just wondering what advice or insights you have encountering maybe this kind of neoliberal feminism narrative in different spheres of governance, like in economic and state and social spaces of governance.
That's exactly where the Care Manifesto comes in and says that we need to change our vocabulary. We need to change our perspective, and we need to think about insourcing. I mean, the stuff that's happening, the financialization of care homes, for example, in the UK, what we saw happening at the beginning of the pandemic was just, it was criminal. And a lot of it has to do with the ways in which care work is being outsourced and is being financialized, so that the workers no longer have any control over their work and in any way, shape, or form. So care becomes, it's the attempt to financialize care. And where do you see the sort of the inability to financialize or to reduce caretaking to the market is precisely in places like nursing, or in places, these are the places where it becomes very clear. And I think that COVID has really, really exposed that. So where the disavowal of interdependency and the devaluing of care, in large part because it's been associated with women and the domestic sphere, right? All of a sudden we became completely dependent. And even those of us who have enough money that could, we began to understand how dependent we are in so many ways on essential workers. So I think that I'll speak a little bit more to that when I talk about the Care Manifesto, because it's precisely trying to shift the conversation away from what the problems are and begin thinking about possibilities for changing the narrative, so that we can begin building a different kind of society at every level, from our interpersonal to the planetary. And it begins with this notion of care, which I'll define. I'll define it as we use it in the manifesto. But that's the question. How do we change the direction where we're going? Because we're going in a very, very catastrophic direction at the moment.
So why don't we take, Felix had a question in the chat box, Laura and myself. Felix,
okay, so
do you want to unmute Felix, or I know you're having some connection issues?
Yeah, so kind of going on just the points of language, how the language has changed and how we are trying to find new language. One of the things that really has stuck out to me with neoliberal feminism is that there is still such a pressure to reproduce, and as a trans person, it's really strange. It feels like I'm completely, like, to the extent that, my existence is, supported in neoliberal feminism, it's entirely as a token. It's entirely as a a way to sell a t-shirt. And I'm just really trying to like nail down this like I get what I consider like a very bioessentialist like worldview of gender, and how that kind of plays into this like transphobic like reactionary movements that are real bad for my community and for myself
and for all of us, I think.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really interesting question, because that was one of the things that I was struggling with neoliberal feminism, because there was a way in which this kind of discourse erases sexual difference, and yet sexual difference reemerges precisely in the balance. And so it was trying to think that through. And what I'm not sure that neoliberal feminism has any more trouble with trans than it does with dealing with questions of race, because it is, as long as you can emulate the work-family balance, then you can be included in its embrace. So the thing about neoliberal feminism is that it is an exclusionary feminism on all kinds of levels, and that it comes and it interpolates, it addresses aspirational women, trans women, I think, could be interpolated so long as you emulate this happy work-family balance. What it does is it reasserts a certain kind of traditional, familial traditionalism, right, a heteronormativity, and also definitely reproduction. So it's interesting and complicated, because I don't think it reintroduces, it doesn't only create a kind of retraditionalism or traditionalism. I think it does that was what I was trying to figure out. And I think the stuff with TERF, right, in the UK, it's a huge thing now. And that was what I was trying to say. It's taken a lot of energy and focus away from all the ways in which the younger generation, I think here, and maybe, it may be a provocative statement, but I think it's also a generational thing. What I see with my students who are in their 20s is there's no issue. There's so little transphobia in the classrooms that I've, at least, it's clear that it's self-selecting, it's a feminist theory course. But it seems to me that it is part of a legacy of a certain kind of radical feminism from the 1970s. And I just don't see it in the same way in the younger generation, which I think is hopeful. Now, I could be wrong, and it could be that it's in the context of London, which is very cosmopolitan and relatively, progressive and heterogeneous place. So again, I'm struggling with trying to understand, it has to bring back that traditionalism through the reproduction, or, and I'm thinking of Billions. I don't know if you guys have seen, so where gender non-binary, protagonists fit in pretty well in the world of, financial capital. So it's this interesting, contradictory discourse. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but I think it's not exactly bioessentialism.
Okay, let's take Laura's question next.
Hey, so I have two questions. I'm hoping there will be time for the second one later, but gonna start with this one. So yes, my question also has to do with this issue of reproduction. I actually feel like for a long time under neoliberalism, at least in the US, there was really kind of like a discouraging sort of influence on reproduction. Definitely this whole, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, don't have children unless you can afford them yourself, blah, 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 blah. And that has changed in the last few years. And I'm really interested to hear what you think about what is behind that change. And it seems like there's a very strong kind of push towards the commodification of children. Now, one thing that I'm noticing is this is obviously happening on the right. Obviously we see this whole sort of like white nationalist influence, and obviously the Christian evangelical, which has always been that way. But, this whole, oh, we have to, populate the white nation state, and we have to win this demographic battle. Then there's this issue that I've really been very disturbed by for a while, which is that I'm hearing that there's something going on even in these immigrant detention centers with, number one, of course, the child separation policy, right? Those children being separated. And then, I'm hearing that there was a Christian, Bethany Services adoption, quote unquote, agency that was basically selling these children, these immigrant children, to Christian families. And in fact, refusing to let their original families have the child back unless they said they were Christian. They were actually asking them that and then saying, no, you can't have your child back unless you're Christian. And then another weird thing that I heard going on in these detention centers was that they were tracking the menstruation cycles of the inmates. And, all kinds of, trigger warning on this one, but, systematic rape going on. So there's like thoughts of, are they trying to produce children in some way in these detention centers? What is behind all of this? And then the other thing that I'm going to mention is that, of course, there's this huge war on abortion rights. And, of course, we have the Supreme Court that's stacked now with all of these right-wing judges. But I've also been seeing in the liberal media a lot of this bemoaning of, oh, we have low birth rates. We don't have enough children being born. Who's going to support the elderly? We won't have anyone paying into Social Security. And so even on the liberal, or did I say neoliberal side, there is this very clear sort of push for an increase in birth rates. Now, of course, this is totally, you would think, well, why aren't they letting immigrants in and children to live here? But yeah, I'm really interested to hear what you think about how all of this fits with what you're saying.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
So I think I have a few comments. Again, I can go back to sort of my thinking about the project, and what I was looking at was really popular and mainstream culture, because I think that that's a really interesting and very important site for understanding sort of the common sense of the moment. And what I was seeing and was struck by when I was reading the New York Times, the Washington Post, was precisely this sort of encouragement of mostly middle class and university educated women to postpone any kind of reproduction. And so there were lots of interviews, I don't remember if it was 2014, with women in elite universities where they said, no, they're not interested. They're not even interested in having relationships. They want to have casual sex because they're not going to have, they want to cultivate their professional life now. And so they were going to postpone. So that's when I started thinking about balance, because basically what was the narrative there? It wasn't that they were completely rejecting reproduction. They were going to defer it until after they had established themselves for a career. And so when you read really closely at the message that was being directed towards these so-called aspirational women was, yeah, it's fine, you can defer it, but not too long. And that's also a little bit later came that egg freezing, that whole bonanza of, so what is that saying? So, okay, no, we want to make sure that women are able to cultivate a profession, which was, again, something quite new in popular and mainstream news. But we want to make sure that you don't completely reject reproduction. And so you've got to keep that balance. You've got to make sure that down the line, you also have children. And so that's sort of what the way that I saw it. So the return or the pressure maybe going back to women having children earlier. There is a decline. This is not something I've looked at recently in terms of its representation now in the U.S. But I don't think that the pressure ever completely disappeared. I think it was that women were being increasingly encouraged to defer. And that was what was so interesting to me, is that why was that? They were being asked to defer, but still you know, at some point they needed to, in order to be really the good feminist now, you needed to have both a job and children. But in your 30s is fine. You know, if 40 is already pushing it a little bit. So, and in terms of what's happening at the border, I think it's a whole, I mean, it's clearly, we've seen, this is something that we see in several colonial societies. This happens where you are, you know, brown children are taken away from brown families and given to often Christian or white families. So this is a similar kind of pattern. And thinking about what it is doing in the United States, I think it's pretty clear. It's the policing of the border, and so what, and this is and what will happen now with Biden. It's interesting to see if he is at all any better on migration, because it certainly doesn't look like it he is. So in terms of understanding sort of the dynamic now, I think it's a convergence of different factors here, and whether it's about the children per se, well, certainly the ways in which migrant children are being treated are not the, well, you know, this is always the contradiction with pro-life. They don't give a shit about they don't care about the children once they're born, right? They're not going to invest in infrastructure that would actually allow the majority of children to have you know, thrive. But it, you know, they're going to make sure that you don't have easy access to abortion for women. So that's a huge contradiction. I don't think it's you know, hasn't gone anywhere. And it's just going to play itself out and become more increasingly.
So I'm going to propose that we, oops, sorry. I was just going to propose that we take the last 3 questions or comments and then maybe move on to part 2. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So I've been pushing myself down stack, but I wanted to ask a question and make a comment as well. Part of why I really wanted you to speak was because so much of your work resonates with some of my own interest in the recuperation of social movements and how that gets used, press ganged into justifying capitalism. And you and my own advisor, Nancy Fraser, focused on feminism. People like Adolph Reed and his son, Toure Reed, have really focused on how anti-racism has been functioning in a similar manner. And I've looked at kind of how the I don't know, anarchist movements like Occupy Wall Street and the Alter Globalization movement also really popularized this call for a better world, and then creating ethical commodities to kind of answer that call, you know, the kind of individualized consumption that's so much a part of especially like subcultural quasi-anarchist movements. I'm curious if you see any tensions or, I don't know, new arrangements between, I mean, these are just 3, we could probably find more. I mean, the environmental movement obviously is another one, but it seems especially, I think, in the last 4 years, around, especially the Bernie Sanders campaign in the United States, that especially a certain form of neoliberal anti-racism has been weaponized in a way to basically posit a kind of analysis of the, you know, every society, and especially capitalism, needs an ethical standard, needs a concept of justice. And I would posit the one for capitalism and neoliberalism is the absence of overt discrimination. We can have, you know, a hierarchical society so long as the goods and the bads are distributed equally amongst men, women, trans, people of color, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, you have, you know, very sincere neoliberals like Becker, who you know, was against racial discrimination because he saw it as an irrational drag on, you know, market efficiency. And these, I think these similar arguments are very widespread, not only in the center and liberal, but I would say even in good chunks of left culture that get mobilized against a more universal oriented politics. And I've really seen that very strikingly in some ways, even on the left. So I'm curious if you see that playing out differently with feminism and how those two also relate to each other, because obviously there's tensions between sex, gender, and racial politics. And it seems to me that the lean-in feminism and the anti-racist neoliberalism have kind of, they're in tension in some way. So I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that.
It's also, you know, it's a loaded question. So for me, because of the reproduction and care work, I think that it is different with neoliberal feminism, and it's not, and that's what I'm trying to, so it's sort of in dialogue with Nancy Fraser, but it's also trying to understand why, how is it possible that feminism, right? So you could do gender equality, right? It could be anti-racism, it could be mobilized in this way. So I think because of the ways in which we rely on reproductive work, reproduction and care work, that it does play a different role. It's not that there aren't similar logics at play in all kinds of, in the ways in which capital, corporations and capital can appropriate various movements and make money off of them. But I don't think that's the only thing that's happening here. And that's basically what my book was trying to distill, and trying to figure out, why is it a little different from homonationalism? Why is it different from various manifestations of the appropriation of progressive movements for capital? So whether it's convincing or not, you guys will tell me, but I think that there is something around this incredible tension within neoliberalism, that it can, it can be anti-racist and it can be classless, even though we know that it exacerbates these, but it needs some kind of vocabulary that deals with reproduction. It can't. So that's sort of at 11 o'clock at night, my answer to you. I can feel myself, and I think it's also interesting because you see it also with care. So what we saw is the care washing, what we call it in the manifesto. So it's this is something that we see again and again and again, right? How corporations just manage to use these progressive terms in order to make money. So I think that there are lots of ways in which the logic is similar, but I think here there may be something different that needs to be taken, that needs to be analyzed in a different way.
Great. Why don't we take Jesse and Jams, and then we'll segue into part 2.
Thanks, Jesse. He, him pronouns are okay. I am currently located in so-called Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. My thinking, I'll try to be really brief, but my thinking was very much following the same line as Blair's in what you proposed as your diagnosis of these two seemingly contrasting terms that nonetheless we take as sort of not odd, because they are so much now part of the zeitgeist of neoliberalism and feminism. Those are totally contrasting notions. How they ever come together is what's peculiar. But I guess in the way that you described it was very useful in your diagnosis of neoliberal feminism as solving a problem that is inherent in the contradictions of capitalism, and especially in neoliberal capitalism. So I guess I was wondering whether or not you had a sense of, and you kind of already illustrated your thinking on this a little bit, but if you or other folks in the group have any sense of there being what would be called a general principle that we might derive from that process of co-opting and appropriation by the dominant social order of a liberatory problem-solving movement, just because much of what we are here together trying to think about is precisely that, how to solve problems, but as opposed to solving problems that close off possibility for greater forms of emancipation and freedom. We want to do the opposite. We want to solve problems that open up more possibility, more ever greater levels of freedom. So I guess that's my question, is whether or not there is some sort of general principle of that process so that we can take that sort of diagnosis kind of work and apply it quickly in other areas. And just really quickly, let's say that, because could we imagine, or might we foresee there being a neoliberal socialism developing, a neoliberal abolitionism developing?
Interesting. Neoliberal socialism, probably not. Neoliberal abolitionism, maybe, but I don't know what that would look like. Really interesting. I think, and there was a response. I don't know that there's a general principle, except that, I'm not essentialist. I think that, it's anything. There's no what we as people interested in a just more egalitarian world is that we need to mobilize politically. And so it's clear to me that all of these terms these terms can be transmogrify, I don't know, they can be manipulated, they can be used in all kinds of ways, and that really what we need to do is continuously orient these terms in the ways that we want. So people come and they often say to me that neoliberalism is feminism isn't feminism. And I think that's not a useful way of thinking about it for me, because exactly why is it not just neoliberalism? Because there is an avowal of gender inequality. It's just that the solution is not the solution that we would want for gender inequality. And you can say that about, and it's true of, we may not agree with radical feminism. We may not agree with, feminism is not any one thing. And so to try and then police the boundaries, that's not what I want to be doing as a feminist. I want to be politically mobilizing and trying to orient the discussions and the politics around a social justice agenda. So if that's so I think there's no way that you can ever prevent the co-optation. I mean, you can use human rights discourse to dominate. You can use any of this stuff as a way of continuing certain kinds of domination. So I think the answer is more a political question for me, and that's where the politics of care comes in. So I don't know if anybody else wants to.
Okay, I think Jam is the last person on stack, and then we can move into part 2. Jam, you with us?
Yeah, how are we doing for time? Because my question isn't that essential. So if we're running behind on time, I'm happy for us to just move on to the next section, if that's going to be easier.
We're basically at the halfway point,
If Jim, if you have something, go for it.
So like, no, it's not really anything. Basically, yeah, just, I guess it's hard when it's hard to frame, because you also just said, the last question almost half answered it as well, and especially saying non-essentialism. But I was just wondering, like, yeah, what are some practical things that I guess can be like reframed, like taking all this in, everything that you've said, and the fact that, like, a predominant amount of, modern day feminism is really focused on the, as we know about, like, equal pay, which is like capitalist focus on capital and capitalist construct. How can we reframe it to kind of undermine that? Like, what are some ideas of reframing, like, in the practical sense?
So I think that's a great segue into the care stuff, because that's exactly what we tried to do. Again, whether we're successful or not, you guys will be able to tell me much better than I can. But I just want to say one thing, and here's the difference, is that, again, this is a difference in terms of understanding neoliberalism, and this goes back to care. It's not just an economic, so the difference between sort of thinking about it as neoliberalism as an ideology is that, for me, it really helps shape us as subjects in even our affective life. So the way that we feel is also shaped by it. And I think that that's an important distinction in terms of the different traditions in which neoliberalism is thought about, where it's not just about capitalism. It's also about the ways in which it creates us in its image. But that's a different question. So I'm going to move on to care, if that's okay. And I don't have as many slides here, but I'll just show you what the Care Manifesto looks like. And I think what's interesting is when you think about now, again, in the wake of COVID, the whole question of care has reemerged in really, really interesting ways. So let me I'll share my screen. And is there anything else, Blair, that I should be, oh no, I did wrong, conscious of in the chat? Because I'm hard for me to do. Good to go? Okay, excellent. So let me go back to this. And so this is really, so one of the concerns, obviously, that I've had in the last few years has been the rise and entrenchment of neoliberalism, as I'm sure a lot of you in the audience. And again, I've been really preoccupied with thinking about how neoliberal rationality helps shape how we understand ourselves and our world. And the kind of theoretical and this kind of theoretical and empirical labor is, I think, really necessary if we're going to imagine and cultivate alternatives to neoliberalism. So in my previous project on the rise of neoliberalism, I do touch upon the question of how we might cultivate alternatives to neoliberal rationality. But again, that book was mostly an attempt to understand and analyze a phenomenon than to provide a political vision for the future. But this is where the Care Manifesto comes in. And this manifesto was actually written collaboratively by 5 people. We began as a reading group made of 5 academics from different disciplines, and we were all activists in various social justice movements, and we began in 2017 to meet. But the manifesto was really a kind of intellectual exercise, kind of what we were talking about all together tonight. But we asked ourselves a specific question: what would the world look like if the organizing principle were care rather than neoliberal carelessness? And so in an effort to conjure up a world organized around care, we decided to look at different scales. So we looked at the planetary, and then we went to economies and the state, to communities, and to our intimate kinship structures. And part of the motivation, precisely, Jam, it was for writing the manifesto, was that we felt that we had gotten really used to dystopian visions of the future, and that we needed a different narrative, a collaborative utopian counter narrative for the 21st century. And in many ways, we were following Naomi Klein's, no is not enough. But I want to also say that the manifesto is meant to be a provocation. I do think that the question of care, and particularly in the wake of COVID, has emerged as a central and urgent concern. And we're not the only ones by any means working in and around care. There's a long tradition of scholars working and activists. But what we do in the Care Collective is we provocatively posit that, in contrast to calls for liberation in the 60s and 70s, care should be the key problematic for politics today. So really what we wanted to do was to contribute to the ongoing conversations around care. There's a long tradition in Native American activism, but there's also a whole feminist ethics of care. And there's a lot of work now being done in the UK with the Women's Budget Group, who are trying to think about what a caring economy would look like. And there are many, many others. But what's interesting and important to note is that we began writing the Care Manifesto in 2019. And so we could never have anticipated how grimly urgent COVID would make the manifesto. And in the manifesto, we echo scholars like Nancy Fraser and Nick Estes, and we posit that the current global crisis, not just COVID, but rising inequality everywhere, endless war, the refugee crisis, and imminent environmental catastrophe, is primarily a crisis of care. It's the result of histories of colonial, imperial, misogynist, and white supremacist violence, but it's also now been compounded by decades of intensified neoliberal policies and the reduction of ever more domains of our lives to market metrics. And we've witnessed now years of austerity in the UK, that's in the US, intensified deregulation and privatization, but we also have seen this go hand in hand with the continuous devaluing of care practices and care work. And here I'm thinking about the nurse who spoke before. And that's in large part due to CARE's historical association with and to women and to the domestic sphere. And what that meant is that, what all of this has meant is that many countries did not have the necessary infrastructure or, of course, the political will to deal effectively with COVID-19. And so one of the things as we completed the manuscript, then COVID hit and we had to rethink, March of last year, care, and all of a sudden there was COVID. And so what we then went back to the Care Manifesto and began thinking of care in light of COVID. And what we say, again, it's not just us, is that COVID has really dramatically and horrifically exposed what we call the reigning politics of carelessness. And yet, on the other hand, the pandemic has also dramatically exposed our profound interdependence. And what is highlighted in all kinds of ways is that our shared vulnerability, and that the need for care is part and parcel of the human condition. And so there are a few key premises that undergird the manifesto's vision of a politics of care. And again, this is about shifting the ways in which we think about care and about politics and about the subject. So one is that in order to build a caring world, we need to begin by avowing and by recognizing that our dependence and our interdependence, and that our survival and our thriving are everywhere and always contingent on others. So that means that the politics of care begins by avowing our mutual interdependencies. But care is not only this, stringlet. It's care is complicated. Care is ambivalent. Care is can often generate aggression. So we need to also address the inevitable ambivalences that care and caregiving often generate. But what we do say is that only once we avow the challenges of our shared dependence as human beings, as well as our vulnerability, as well as our irreducible differences and our many ambivalences around care, can we fully value the resources necessary to promote the capabilities of everybody. So again, a caring politics is one that recognizes the intricacies and ambivalences of human interactions. And such a politics, we argue, is better poised to enhance democratic processes on all levels of society, because only when you can work with and through ambivalence and contradictory emotions can you really build a sustainable democratic community. But another key premise, and this is one that seems pretty obvious, is that only by ensuring that communities have ample resources, infrastructure, but also time, can we create the conditions that render a caring disposition toward the other, however distant, ever more possible. So when we think about caring time, when we take care of others, it's a different kind of time than neoliberal time. One is slow, focused, attentive, and repetitive often. The second is accelerated and extensive. So we need to think about time and caring time. But how do we understand care? Well, in the manifesto, we are drawing here specifically on Joan Tronto's tripartite, which is between caring for, which includes the physical aspects of hands-on care, caring about, which describes our emotional investment in and attachment to others, and caring with, which describes how we mobilize together politically in order to transform our world. In the Care Manifesto, we expand on those insights, and we ask a different kind of question, a slightly different kind of question. We ask after, what are the conditions of possibility that would make caring for, make caring about, and making caring with ever more possible? So here, again, the Care Manifesto is not claiming newness in any way, but it's drawing on a long tradition of feminist political theory, of care ethics, but also on non-Western notions of kinship, where non-human life and the earth itself are considered kin. And we begin with a diagnostic, but this time not like the rise of neoliberalism, it's very short. But we diagnose the interconnected nature of what we call the current reign of carelessness. And we use scales. So we begin from the global dimension, discussing the climate crisis and economies that put profit over people. And then we travel down, or scale down, as it were, through to careless states, communities, to how what we call the banality of carelessness affects our interpersonal intimacies. So the diagnosis goes from the planetary to the most intimate, and then we move up. And then we travel outward, scaling up from the interpersonal to the planetary in order to outline caring alternatives to our contemporary condition of carelessness. And we decided to use the scalar structure. It's really just a methodological organizing tool, because we wanted to show how our capacities to care are also interdependent and can only be cultivated and realized by avowing the inextricable interconnections among all of the different scales. So I'm going to now make this a little bit more concrete, but still in very broad strokes, some of the kinds of caring alternatives that we offer in our manifesto. So if we begin with the interpersonal and we talk about caring alternatives, when we think about the heteronormative neoliberal feminist balance stuff. So for us, caring alternatives begins from the most intimate aspects of our life, kinship. And we argue that we need to reimagine the limits of familiar care to embrace more promiscuous models of kinship. And here we draw on examples. Again, we draw on examples from the past. These things have existed. They're not just utopian. And how do we then make them or remake them for the 21st century? So we invoke examples from the Black Panthers, along from feminist and gay liberation healthcare initiatives of the 1970s. And we draw on the ACT UP activist Douglas Crimp's notion of promiscuous. And what Crimp uses promiscuous, not in the sense of casual or indifferent, but to describe the experimental ways that gay men were intimate with and cared for one another during the AIDS epidemic. So these experimental intimacies, these promiscuous intimacies, ultimately served as the basis for the safer sex initiatives that went on to save so many lives. So the concept of promiscuous care that we develop at the scale of kinship recognizes that history, culture, and habit make some forms of care more likely than others, such as parental care. But promiscuous care also recognizes that not all women want to be mothers and not all men want to be fathers, whether they can be or not, and that caring for children who are not your own, caring for the community, and caring for the environment are equally valuable tasks that must be adequately resourced and appreciated. And so when we think about the neoliberal defunding and undermining of care, which a number of people in the audience have talked about, right? So that's what it looks like when, whether you're working with disabled or with, as a nurse. So when you when you defund and undermine care work, what it leads to, or care in any shape or form, it leads to paranoid and chauvinist caring imaginings. It leads to looking after your own, right, our own. And what the manifesto insists is that with adequate resources, time and labor, people would feel more secure, or more likely would feel more secure enough to care for, about, and with strangers. So what promiscuous care means here, again, it's changing the language. Sometimes it means caring more and in ways that remain experimental and extensive by current standards. It means multiplying who we care for and how. And then when we move to community, we talk about, and a lot of this will sound very familiar. Again, it's not, the manifesto is not claiming newness. It's trying to think about it, though, through the lens of care. It argues that the only way to cultivate and maintain caring communities is by amplifying the spaces that are public, that are shared, that are cooperative. So communities that care need to stop hoarding, stop the hoarding of resources by the few. I mean, that's instead caring communities need to prioritize the commons. Communities based on care ensure that the creation of collective public spaces, as well as objects, encourage a sharing infrastructure. That means that we need to reverse neoliberalism's compulsion to privatize everything. And again, we have examples from the past and from the present where these kinds of communities exist. So the question is, how do we scale these up? It means, of course, cheaper, free public transport and public lending facilities, including local libraries of tools and equipment, as well as books. It means ending the costly and damaging outsourcing of care and other basic services by insourcing. That's a major, by bringing them back into the public sector and communities. So it's only by imagining and creating communities that are adequately resourced, co-produced, and that enable us to connect, to deliberate, to disagree, to debate with one another, as well as to support each other's needs, can we confront and work through the complexities of and ambivalences created by our avowal of our mutual dependencies. So then we move to a caring. So as we move from caring kinship to caring communities and caring states, the manifesto also asks, what are the conditions that would enable the expansion rather than the contraction of democratic participation at all levels? And clearly part of that answer lies in reimagining the state. Now, for some of you, the state is a problematic institution or authority, but here we try and think against and with the state. So a caring state is clearly one in which the provision for all of our basic needs and sharing infrastructure are ensured, while at the same time participatory democracy is deepened at every level. But a state can only be caring if notions of belonging are based on recognition of mutual interdependencies rather than ethno-cultural identity and racialized borders. So creating caring states requires not only recognition of past atrocities, but also reckoning with forms of reparation for them, whether genocide, slavery, and or dispossession. It's definitely abolitionist, yes. Only by confronting the past and prioritizing the needs of those who have been most marginalized, violated, and negated by uncaring nation states will we be able to move forward into a juster future and cultivate a radically different way of relating to others in the world itself. So of course that means we need to turn the current priorities of the state on its head. It also means renewing models of welfare and social provision while refusing post-war welfare states' rigid hierarchies and sexual and ethnic division of labor, as well as all racialized policies. Now, caring states, of course, clearly need to rebuild and safeguard a affordable housing, along with high quality public schooling, university education, vocational training, and healthcare. But what that also means, so as soon as you start thinking about care as the organizing principle, that means that education and vocational training are transformed because they emphasize care and caretaking practices. And so the kind of graduate that we would want, or the kind of young person or adult, would be, the emphasis would be developing the capacities, the capabilities of each person to hone their caring skills, while insisting that learning is about enhancing old, as well as discovering new ways to nurture life and the world. And finally, caring states with sustainable economies and porous borders, we argue, are the best possible way to global care, and what we call transnational conviviality, which is about cultivating a transnational orientation of care toward the stranger. So we need, of course, our caring imaginaries have to move beyond the nation state to the furthest reaches of the strangest part of the planet, both human and non-human. So ultimately then, and coming full circle, it's only by imagining and by acknowledging and valuing rather than disavowing our global interdependencies. And we see this happening right now in all of the discussions about the patent and the vaccine. So rather than disavowing, we need to avow our global interdependencies so that we can, in order to create any kind of caring world. So the Care Manifesto calls for inventive forms of collective care at every single scale of life. And so what does that mean? So care then becomes our individual and common ability to provide the political, the social, the material, and the emotional conditions that allow for the greatest possible number of people and living creatures on this planet, along with the planet itself, to thrive. And as I said at the outset, this is a utopian, this is grandiose project, but it does attempt to provide an alternative to neoliberalism and an alternative narrative. So I'm going to stop there and then take any questions, comments that you might have.
All right, thanks so much, Catherine. So the floor is open if folks want to get on stack again. Chris, please start us off.
Sorry, just get my camera on. Hi everyone, so I'm calling from Birmingham, UK, so I'm probably one of the closest people to you, Catherine. Yeah, I use he and pronouns. And I suppose my question would be, could you give us any examples of how caring would look like when mobilizing together, for instance, in like a campaigning group or a political project or other things?
On what, any level in particular?
On just mobilizing, I'm not sure if, yeah, I suppose I'm just looking for examples as to how you might, what sort of situations it would be relevant in. And
so it's very in mutual aid. So what happened with mutual aid was exactly an example of a kind of, organically grew up out of the crisis as a kind of caring alternative. And there are lots of problems with the mutual aid, because it meant that the government, that it was basically coming in where the government was failing. But still, you see that, and one of the things that we had a lot of discussions around is how you see these kinds of caring alternatives emerge precisely in the wake of crises. And so, how do we think about ways of creating them where they're not just the reaction to crises, and as soon as the crisis has ended, you begin to, that you go back to the status quo. So there are lots of examples that you can think about. I mean, there's the Preston example in terms of communities, or in Barcelona, in terms of community, the new municipalism are examples where the concrete examples of, or, and the NHS, which was basically the scaling up of the Welsh miners, I forgot the name now, where with the scaling up with the model that was used, it was the miners who already self-organized in order to provide medical care. And so that was the model that was used to scale up to create the NHS. But lots of examples that we have from the past, Standing Rock is one of the examples that we use as a possible alternative. Of course, it was also in response to crisis. So how do we think beyond the crisis? How do we think about ways of shifting the narrative in the conversation? And what's interesting about COVID is that there was a moment where I actually thought it was possible. I mean, in the blink of the eye, who thought that, you know, governments across the world would just, you know, these national lockdowns, that it can happen. But how we mobilize and how we do it, that's the question, right? And I think that we have to find multiple ways of organizing on all different levels in order to make it happen. I mean, so it's not I'm sure the programmatic answer that you wanted in terms of how we do it. I mean, we all do it in different ways. So now I'm very involved in trying to reimagine the university of the UK. The UK is, higher education is not only neoliberalized, it's in crisis in all kinds of ways. So how do we think about a caring university? So we're mobilizing around that question. And, you know, part of so I'm very pessimistic that will succeed, but part of it is creating the kinds of networks and community and the struggle in itself, which is amazing.
All right, I'm going to go with Mark next here.
Okay, I have a question. Catherine, you mentioned, do you hear me?
I do.
Great. You mentioned the effect that the COVID crisis had on care, how people look at care, and earlier you mentioned the effect that Trump had on these popular feminist movements. And now my question is, both of them are over. Trump isn't in power anymore, and just let me get to the point. And we have the vaccines, and COVID isn't as present as before. And now, by the way, I'm from Switzerland. We had this really big movement in 2019, the biggest demonstration ever in our country, the Feminist Strike. And actually on Monday, now it's the next one. And I have the feeling it's not going to be as great, as big. So what is your feeling? How is this on a globally, in the UK, elsewhere, these two things, care and popular feminism, is it something that was just out of the moment, or do we really have a perspective for the future?
So I'm not sure exactly how I want to answer that. I do think that there are ways in which where things happen is in part how we mobilize. I don't think I'm not that optimistic that we're going to manage to create a better future, but we have to try. And I think that COVID care is everywhere now. And so how do we, again, it comes back to the question is, how do you maintain the counter-hegemonic understanding of care? How do we mobilize around it? I mean, there was a moment where, you know, one of the projects I'm now working on has to do with these sort of symbolic displays of gratitude for care workers. But there was a moment in which care was valued, even if it was symbolic. So how do we then use that momentum going forward to demand that care work is valued just as much as academic work? We see that we cannot survive without the work of key and essential workers. So part of it is about maintaining and not doing whatever we can in order for it not to then just disappear. Because what we see in the UK is that the displays of symbolic gratitude did not translate into better pay, did not translate into more, you know, public support for the NHS. It's led to continuous cronyism and corruption. So, but there is a sense in which new kinds of mobilizations are possible, and because of the ways in which care, and that was sort of what I was trying to say, and ways of being optimistic in the midst of real scary threats to all of us. Also with the neoliberal feminism, that the ways in which popular feminism disseminated feminism gives us a moment in which we can then mobilize again and try and maintain the counter-hegemonic discourse on feminism or care. And there are, I mean, in the UK, I'm trying to think of, you know, the women's budget group, if there have been massive mobilization, what's happening now around Kill the Bill. So a lot of the stuff has been some of the more interesting mobilizations. So trying, you know, these new policing to stop demonstrations, which is also in the wake of COVID, which was used as an excuse during COVID. And so you've seen this really interesting mobilization around Kill the Bill, lots of young people, lots of coalitions. And so that's part of where you see the hope. And how did we then expand it? I wish I had the answer. I wish I knew, you know, but so I do think that I don't think COVID is over. I think that COVID is here and will be here for a while. And, you know, the struggles around sort of patents and distributions of vaccinations, that's just one symptom of all these other issues too. So there are many, yeah. Anybody want to jump in and help me? Think about where to go from here. Come on, you.
We will, in all likelihood, open up the breakout rooms. At the end of this, folks usually keep the conversation going, and I expect the full 5-year plan by the time we meet again tomorrow. I'm going to monkey with the stack a little bit to hear from some folks that we haven't heard from yet. So if we get, or in a while at least, Anya and Alex up next would be great.
Hi, my name's Anya. I use she, her pronoun. I'm from Seattle. And I, first off, really appreciate the section on like reparative care in the Care Manifesto. I really appreciate of what you said on that. But my question is what's your take on the relationship between reparative and like perhaps equitable care and the idea and act of self-care, which I would say has, of course, has Black feminist roots, but I think personally, I view it as it's falling currently in this like neoliberal, maybe popular feminist circle, specifically how it is used for neoliberal feminists to use it as a mechanism of opting out of providing the care that you're laying out, namely reparative care. Does that make sense?
I want you to help me through how you define the difference, or how you see the difference between reparative and equitable care.
Oh, I'm not saying that there is a difference. I'm just saying of I've noticed the phenomenon of this usage of self-care as a mechanism of opting out of providing reparative care.
Absolutely, and I think that you see that everywhere. And so but again, it's both within sort of neoliberal feminist, popular feminism, but it's also within larger structures of neoliberalism. So self-care, how do you, I mean, it's one of the ways in which neoliberalism devolves responsibility for the care of communities and people is by telling them they need to self-care, right? And so self-care is sort of one of the ways in which we are all then encouraged, and in fact, we're forced to care for ourselves rather than thinking about self-care in its radical origins, right? So you have self-care as the solution to structural violence, right? So when you think about in the workplace, you think about the ways in which we're working more, where our wages are devaluing. That's a word. And what's the solution? How, it's our problem. We need to find ways of, we need a some kind of, we need to pay for symposium on well-being and self-care. So it becomes it becomes part of the mechanisms where we are individualized and responsibilized. So we're made responsible for taking care of ourselves. And this is part and parcel of the larger neoliberal operations. So you're absolutely right. And again, it's also like what we were talking about before, the ways in which these radical concepts are emptied out of their radical significance and used for making money. I mean, the self-care stuff is huge in popular culture. We spend a lot of money, and I don't think that self-care there's nothing wrong with self-care. We often do need self-care in order to be what I say, in terms of being a good parent or being a good friend, is we also have to make sure that we're okay. But that's when you have the infrastructure and a caring infrastructure that enables you to self-care, so that the self-care doesn't come in lieu of the kinds of social infrastructure that need to be there, if that makes sense.
Thank
losing
you.
the plot a little bit, as they say in the UK.
We're gonna have to do some collective self-care and recognize that it's very late for you, and be merciful with the questions. Maybe let you get out.
No, you don't have to be merciful with the questions. Good questions. I'll keep thinking about them. Ask as difficult and as provocative as you want. Doesn't mean that I'll have good answers, but I love hearing the questions.
I solely mean that it's just so late for you.
Yeah.
So we've got Alex and Laura up next.
All right. Well, I definitely do appreciate you staying up with us. And so my question is a bit of a selfish question, because it's kind of helping me think through my own research, but I think it's a question that I think is very, very much relevant to this group and just thinking about politics in general, which is I'm interested in this idea of kind of autonomous social reproduction. So maybe mutual aid being an example of this, as well as sort of other DIY practices, particularly coming from an anarchist lens. But of course, there's this kind of tension there, which is like, do these things actually scale up? Are they going to lead to the large scale transformation that we're looking for? And then, of course, there's the question of the state. And so I was wondering how, like in your collaborative writing, how you kind of thought about this. And of course, I should go and read the manifesto, which I definitely plan on doing. I think it'll be very useful for my research. I'm just wondering, like, how we think about the state. Were there sort of maybe different views within the collective, and particularly one of the things that I think about is the way in which care institutions or care infrastructure like healthcare can also be kind of places of oppression, exclusion, discrimination, etc. And even when we think about kind of social democratic states, we see kind of very awful xenophobia, racism, etc. I'm just thinking about recent examples with Denmark, which have been pretty worrying. So yeah, I guess that's just kind of my vague question, which is like, how do we think about that, particularly within your kind of work on neoliberalism as well?
It's a really pertinent question, because we had a lot of discussions about the state and whether we wanted to talk about the caring state at all. And none of us at the time identified as anarchists. It was, Lynn Siegel is a socialist feminist, and we're coming more from the socialist tradition. And I have actually increasingly been, I'm in an anarchist reading group and becoming increasingly, my tendencies are more and more towards anarchy and anarchist thought and really thinking about the state. The argument that we had was that given the size of the problems or the existential threats, that we cannot do away with something like the state in order to also distribute the goods and ensure, but how do we do that while at the same time thinking about it, rethink the relationship between the state, which would no longer be a nation state, it would be a caring state, and what that means, and maybe eventually the state would disappear, right, as we imagine it, because it's also dependent on all these other levels. So we had lots of conversations, and Lynn was, some of us were more skeptical about thinking that a state could ever be caring, and other of us were very insistent that we needed that in order to think about it at all of the different levels, and for it to think about something that was actually possible given all of the issues that are facing us at this moment, that we needed something like the caring state. And we tried to think about how we imagine the caring state in terms of welfare, but completely refigured so that it doesn't have the same kind of sexual division of labor, it doesn't have the same kind of race. It's utopian. So it's beginning to think about what it is that we need in order to begin, providing more answers to the kinds of questions that not only questions, the climate catastrophe is threatens us with the extinction of the human sapiens. So how do we think of, so there were those kinds of discussions, and I think that since writing also I changed my thinking. We all change after writing. This is why we continue writing, because if we got it right once, we would stop, and we would so it was really just a provocation to think about what would a world look like. How can 5 of us come together? We wrote it together. It was like the most frustrating, excruciating, amazing process ever, to have 5 people thinking together about how we wanted to change the world. So, it's so ambitious and it's so crazy, and yet the notion of care is taken on. And I think that, so in terms of how do we scale up, well, we tried to think of examples where it did happen, so that we don't think that it's impossible, because there are ways in which there have been these kinds of scaling up, and so much of what so sort of the sort of premises that we came to was that so much of the violence, aggression is psychosocial also. So there's also the psychosocial element, which is how do we create conditions so that all of the, our aggressions, our ambivalence are minimalized. So how does that work on all of these levels? So it's a long-winded answer to you, but we did have those discussions, and ultimately we didn't think that in terms of imagining a world at this point that we could in any way do away with something like a state.
Thank you.
That's right. I said caring state. Now that's an oxymoron. Yet coming from an anarchist, of course it is.
So let's take the last 3 here and maybe together, and then we can give you a chance to go at them and close and get some rest as well. So I'm going to mix it up and go with Max, Justin, and Forrest. And we'll just take those together and we'll close the stack.
All right, thanks for your talk. I'm excited to read the book. I'm curious if you could talk about how care could be emancipatory. Considering how care often smooths the rough edges of capitalism, how can care workers, care practitioners, resist the commodification of their work and make their work liberatory, not just meliorist? And maybe tied into that, could you talk about what care looks like in some of the communalist experiments happening around the world? Thanks.
You want me to answer that immediately, Blair?
Let's take all 3, and then you can just pull from whatever you choose. So Justin, and then Forrest.
Okay, cool. Yeah, this is actually probably more of a statement than a full question per se. But I would just like to mention that during the COVID-19 outbreak, and as a social anarchist as well as a communalist, I'd also like to mention that there was a major outbreak of mutual aid organizing that was made in response to quite frankly, the criminal negligence of the U.S. state, especially towards COVID-19 and both the economic and health fallout for that. I'm also wanting to get involved with nurse unionized as well, but I definitely wanted to mention, because you're talking about the caring state, and there's such little thing there, such little stuff going on there. But I would just like to mention there is that care work and that branch towards freedom and liberation going on. It's just going at the grassroots level and not at the top down level. And I believe that the mutual aid, and I've been involved with that, and I'm pretty sure other people who've been involved with that here as well have experienced, and will say that that type of bottom-up organizing towards mutual aid and towards care is happening.
All right, Forrest, and then we'll let Catherine have the last word.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm actually an hour ahead coming out of Berlin. I work in the office of the student union here in Berlin, and it's an anarchist communist organization. And during the pandemic, we basically made the university run. And we've been doing this for a very, very long time too, and we're pretty damn good at it, which is also one of the issues, because literally we're the only thing that's functioning right now. It's like we've had a cyber attack, university, literally everything at university went down because it's all centralized through SAP. We had our database was still functioning. We have, I think the collective, it's something like 50 people. The university is incredibly well organized though, as far as the students go. Most of them are in unions. Basically everyone's unionized. Even the professors are unionized. I think the thing that's extremely frustrating though is, and we're able to survive. The other part is too, we're able to get by. But the other thing I find extremely frustrating is what next? Because the president of the university, they don't want to really discuss with us. They say that they're busy, type deal like this. We've squatted the university before. I mean, we're down for that too. We're constantly doing actions like this. And just as far as ideas go, it's because at that point it's what is the next step? It's literally a at some point you're okay, well, we kind of run the place already. How do we move past that too? Because it's also quite frustrating, sitting there in the office, answering all the questions, because literally the university just won't answer any of the questions. So we're taking questions about insurance and adding all of these to our work. And absolutely, I'm proud to do that and try it. We want to help people. But yeah, at some point I feel like you're sitting there, we're we've been doing this, since the fall of the wall, and we're good at it, but how the hell what's the next thing? I think that's one thing. And I think that's the thing we're constantly struggling to in a lot of our meetings too, is how do we escalate this possibly more?
That's the question, right? How do we, and I think part of it is about getting people from around the world talking to see how it happens and how it happens in different places. But I wish I had a good answer for that, but I think that the kinds of connections that you make and learning from the past examples where it's been possible, and also what's happening around the world and how to make, the connections between various mobilizations is really key. And that's where technology can be incredibly useful as a tool for the left. So you guys will continue, and you will then report back to me what needs to be done next in terms of how to move, how to scale up, because that's always going to be the question. And that's all, revolution, yeah, but then what happens after the revolution? We see also that that's not always the utopian answer to the question. And so for me, part of it is about, I'm a literary scholar, so for me, narratives are important. These the kinds of the vocabulary, the kinds of ways that we narrate ourselves and the world are crucial. And this goes back to the question, I think, on care. So the manifesto was really to tell a different story, and there are lots of different stories that can be told. This was just one of the examples. This was one of the ways that we could use a moment in time where care was everywhere for thinking about a better world. And what is different about the care for us, I think, there are lots of people who have been working on care, and there are lots of different philosophies of care that are non-Western, that I don't have access to, but I'm learning through precisely these kinds of conversations, and it's about making those kinds of connections. But for us, care is really capacious, and it means different things at different levels. And it's part of why we have the scales, is because care on the level of kinship but we're asking ultimately the the larger question, which is what are the conditions of possibility for a world in which we can care more for each other, for the stranger, and for the planet. And so that's really what is motivating us. It's the conditions that enable us to thrive in a world that is under threat. And so care, it's not only about caring, hands-on care. It's not only about our, I care for, the people in my immediate, but it is about caring with, and it's about how do we create a more just world. So I think that the question that we ask and the answer that we give may be in this forum too, may be slightly different, but those are the kinds of questions that we have to ask after the conditions, not just which will make these utopian visions ever more possible. We're never going to get rid of natural disasters. We're never going to get rid of human aggression, but how can we create a society in which where we can ameliorate those potentials? So yeah, ameliorating is not always a bad thing. We're never going to, eliminate completely the possibility of, the world ending by, the sun, whatever. But how do we make it ever more possible for caring, for us to take care of the non-human, and that we try and lay out a vision, and it's very clear at every level that it has to do with not infrastructure, it has to do with time, it has to do with resources, and it has to do with creating the possibilities of more commons together on different levels, and yeah, so that, I don't know if that answered, Max, your question, but that's, in terms of not in terms of thinking about care beyond care work and care giving, because care is a lot more than that. It's about the possibility of a better future.
I think that's a perfect place to end.
Yeah, wow, it's almost 12.
Yeah, thanks so much for staying up with us and kicking off, getting such a great input and such a great conversation started. And these maniacs, I know a good chunk of them are going to stay and keep talking about it for like the next several hours as we leave this open. I, on the other hand, I'm going to go, I don't know, walk on the beach or something.
Okay. So. Blair, can I just thank you for inviting me? And also I want to thank all of you for the amazing questions. And if I would love to be in dialogue. So if you want to contact me, if you have any questions and we want to continue the conversation, I'd love it. This is how connections are made. And thanks so much for listening to me and for asking the questions.
Our mutual pleasure.
I'm going to sleep though, now.
Go get some rest.
So continue. I hope it continues to be so generative. Thanks so much.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks again. And I will open up the breakout rooms for those who are going to bounce. We will start again tomorrow at 10 a.m. Dan Choderkoff will do part 2 of the politics and philosophy of social ecology. And yeah, thanks so much everybody for the great questions, great input. And if you want to stick around, breakout rooms are coming.